moment in your life that you did not want to forget? My name's Jess, and I can remember this one time that I was sitting on the beach in Palm Beach, Florida. The water was so blue, the sun was shining, the temperature was perfect, and I remember sitting there on the beach not wanting to forget that moment. So I took a picture. Actually, I took a couple hundred pictures, so I would not forget that moment and that view and that water. It was amazing. Maybe like me, you use reminders or pictures to help you remember things that matter to you. Because we all know how easy it is to forget, right? We go on the best vacation ever, but then it's back to school and real life and the normal routine of things. You have an epic game-winning shot in the championship, but then the season ends and it's on to the next sport. The moment happens, but then you move on and forget. The same can be true when it comes to our faith. When things are going well in our lives, it's easy to forget how much we need Jesus. Sometimes we go through our days without thinking about him at all. And other times when life feels difficult or frustrating, we do the same thing. In those times, it's easy to forget the ways we've seen God work in our lives in the past because we can only see the difficult things happening around us in the present. So over the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at some different conversations that Jesus had with his followers during his last days on earth. You see, Jesus knew his time here was coming to an end. He knew that God sent him to earth to die on the cross so that we could be close with God forever. Knowing that, Jesus wanted to make the most of every moment. He saved some of his best wisdom for his last days so that it would continue to echo after he was gone. The good news for us is that several of Jesus' followers shared or wrote down stories about what Jesus said and did so others could learn from him too. There was a guy named Luke who investigated people's stories, observations, and experiences to understand what Jesus said and did, and then he wrote about it. One of the experiences that Luke wrote down happened during what's known as the Passover holiday. Back then, Passover was a celebratory meal that helped Jewish people remember something God had done for them long ago. Hundreds of years before Jesus came to earth, God did something really cool. God rescued the Israelites, who were God's people, out of slavery. And when that happened, God wanted the Israelites to celebrate Passover, to remember the way that God had protected them and set them free. And it was such a big deal that even thousands of years later, Jewish people today still celebrate the Passover meal to remember the event. During the Passover meal that Jesus had with his disciples, Jesus chose to give some of his final instructions. This was the last meal Jesus had with his disciples, so it was a pretty big deal. Let's take a look. When the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table. Jesus said, "I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. For I tell you now that I won't eat this meal again until its meaning is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Jesus was eager to share one of his last moments with his closest friends. He had been looking forward to this meal. Maybe that's because Jesus knew he was about to suffer and die on the cross. He knew he was about to leave his disciples overwhelmed with fear and sadness. So Jesus wanted to make sure they would remember all the things he taught them. So here's what he did. Then he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. Then he said, "Take this and share it among yourselves, for I will not drink wine again until the kingdom of God has come." He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." What's cool about this story from Luke is that Jesus actually gave us a great way to remember him. While Jewish people use Passover to remember what God had done for them, we have communion. That's what Jesus was demonstrating when he broke bread with his disciples that day. And when we participate in communion, we're remembering together what Jesus has done and is doing in our lives. With his disciples, Jesus used bread and wine to help them remember him. And Jesus did this on purpose. You see, the Israelites were familiar with how God had used bread and wine throughout their story. And now bread and wine were no longer just things to eat. The bread and wine were symbols of remembrance for what God had already done and what would happen to Jesus in just a few days. So when we participate in communion together, we remember what Jesus has done for us. We remember what Jesus has done to know he is still working. Think of it like this. When I look back at that picture from the beach, it reminds me of my trip there and my time there on the beach. And the same is true with our faith. When life gets hard or when you feel discouraged, you can remember what Jesus has done for you in the past to remind you that he is still working for you right now. Jesus told his disciples to remember. He knew that tough times were ahead, and those tough times would make it hard for the disciples to remember all that Jesus had taught them, all he did, and the way he loved them. That's why in one of his last moments, Jesus told them to remember. It's almost as if he was saying, I want you to remember that I am for you and that I am coming back. Jesus is saying the same thing to us too. Sometimes what we're going through in life can be so overwhelming. Maybe we feel alone or anxious or afraid. It's in those moments we might even feel like Jesus isn't with us or for us at all. When life isn't going the way we hoped, it's important to remember what Jesus did so we know he's still with us and still for us. In other words, we remember what Jesus has done to know he is still working. What would look different about our lives if we decided to remember what Jesus has done for us? I think it would change the way we see our circumstances. It would help us see God working in the good things and give us hope that God is still working in the tough things. And here's how you can start. First, make a list. Make a list of all the things you've seen God do in your life or the lives of others close to you. Let this list encourage you and give you hope that Jesus is still working. Then choose a reminder. In the same way Jesus chose bread and wine as his reminders for his disciples, choose something in your life to be a reminder of what Jesus has done and is doing in your life. And finally, look for God. It could be as simple as asking yourself, where did I see God today? That's a great question to remind you to look for God working in your life every single day. Can you imagine what might change in your life if you started remembering what Jesus has done? I know it might not be an easy thing to do because it requires us to remember, and sometimes remembering can be difficult. But what if we just start with remembering one thing Jesus has done? I think it could change a lot more than you think.